Montana Territory, 1883. A lone woman. A drifting cowboy. One quiet kiss that changed everything. When Eliza Hartwell finds a stranger at her gate asking only for water and a warm meal, she has no idea she's about to discover what it means to finally stop running from love. But in a land where trust is earned in silence and survival depends on choosing the right partner, can two broken souls build something that lasts? Stay with me until the end of this story, and if it touches your heart, hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The Montana sky hung low and gray the evening Caleb Rowan appeared at Eliza Hartwell's gate, and she knew before he even spoke that he was the kind of man who carried his past like a stone in his pocket. Heavy, silent, impossible to set down. She saw him from the window first, a dark shape against the fading light, his horse standing with its head low, flanks heaving. The animal was done in. The man wasn't much better. He sat in the saddle like he'd forgotten how to dismount, shoulders rounded, hat pulled low. For a long moment, he simply stared at her cabin, at the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney, at the garden patch she'd fenced off with split rails and stubbornness. Eliza set down the bowl she'd been drying and reached for the rifle. She'd lived alone on this homestead for nearly 2 years now, ever since her father had taken sick and died in the span of a single brutal winter. The land was hers by rights, 160 acres of rock and sage and wind-scoured grass that fought her for every potato, every ear of corn. The cabin was solid enough, built by her father's hands before age had bent them crooked. The well was good. The barn needed patching, but it stood. She had chickens, 3 goats, a milk cow that had seen better days, and a solitude so complete it had become a kind of companion. She did not miss people. People had opinions about a woman alone. People had questions she didn't care to answer. People looked at her with either pity or suspicion, and she'd grown weary of both. But this man at her gate, he wasn't looking at her at all. He was looking at the water trough by the barn, the one she kept filled for her own animals, and the expression on his face was pure, uncomplicated need. Eliza stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled in the crook of her arm, and watched as he finally swung down from the saddle. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side, and when his boots hit the ground, he stood there a moment, one hand braced against the horse's shoulder, as though the earth itself might betray him. "Evening," he called, his voice rough with disuse. She didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the cottonwoods down by the creek, a sound like water over stones, and somewhere a hawk cried out, hunting the last light. "You lost?" she asked finally. He shook his head. "No, ma'am, just passing through." Passing through to where? He hesitated, and in that pause she understood that he didn't have an answer. Men like him never did. They were always heading somewhere, always just about to arrive, and they never stopped long enough to realize they'd been running in circles. "Yellowstone country," he said at last. "Heard there's work up that way." "Yellowstone's north of here. You're heading west." A faint smile touched his mouth, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Reckon my sense of direction suffered some." "Reckon it has." They stood in silence, the distance between them measured in more than yards. Eliza studied him in the failing light, the dust on his coat, the worn-through knees of his trousers, the way his gun belt sat low on his hips like he'd lost weight and hadn't bothered to adjust for it. His face was lean, weathered dark by sun and wind, with lines carved deep at the corners of his eyes. She guessed him to be somewhere in his 30s, though hard living had a way of aging a man beyond his years. "I don't mean to trouble you," he said. "I saw your light and thought, well, I thought if you could spare some water for my horse, I'd be grateful. He's about done in." Eliza glanced at the animal. It was a good horse, or had been once, a gray gelding with intelligent eyes and ribs showing through its hide. The saddle was old but well kept, the tack mended in a dozen places. A working man's horse, a careful man's horse. "Water's free," she said. "Help yourself." He nodded his thanks and led the gray toward the trough. The horse drank in long, desperate pulls, and Caleb stood beside it with one hand on its neck, murmuring something too low for Eliza to hear. She watched the way he touched the animal, gentle, patient, the hands of someone who understood what it meant to be worn down to nothing. When the horse had drunk its fill, Caleb straightened and looked back at her. "I'm obliged." She should have let him go then, should have watched him lead that tired horse back out into the gathering dark and disappeared from her life as quickly as he'd entered it. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. Instead, she heard herself say, "You eaten today?" He went still. "Ma'am?" "I asked if you've eaten." He stopped, seemed to gather himself. "Not since yesterday morning." Eliza shifted the rifle to her other arm. "I've got stew on the stove, more than I'll eat myself. You're welcome to a bowl if you want it." For a moment she thought he might refuse. Pride was a strange thing in men. Sometimes it kept them upright when nothing else would, and sometimes it was the very thing that killed them. "That's kind of you," he said carefully. "I don't want to impose. If it was an imposition, I wouldn't have offered." Another pause, and then he nodded. "Then I accept. Thank you." "You can put your horse in the barn," Eliza said. "There's hay in the loft and grain in the bin by the door. Don't overfeed him. He'll colic." "Yes, ma'am." She turned and went back into the cabin, leaving the door open behind her. It was a calculated risk, letting a strange man know she was alone. But she'd learned to read people in the 2 years since her father's death. This one wasn't dangerous. Dangerous men didn't ask permission. Dangerous men didn't say thank you. Dangerous men didn't gentle their horses with words meant to soothe. Still, she kept the rifle close. Inside, the cabin was warm and close, smelling of wood smoke and the venison stew she'd had simmering since morning. It was a simple space. One room with a sleeping loft above, a stone fireplace, a table her father had built, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner. Shelves lined one wall, holding her mother's dishes, her father's books, jars of preserves she'd put up last fall. The floor was packed earth covered with rag rugs she'd braided through the long winter nights when the wind screamed down from the mountains, and there was nothing to do but sit by the fire and keep her hands busy. She ladled stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table, cut thick slices from the loaf of bread she'd baked that morning, poured water from the pitcher into tin cups. Then she sat down in one chair, laid the rifle across her knees, and waited. He took his time with the horse. She could hear him moving around in the barn, the low murmur of his voice, the rustle of hay. When he finally emerged, he'd removed his hat and was running one hand through dark hair that wanted cutting. He stopped at the threshold, silhouetted against the last purple light of evening. "Come in," Eliza said, "before you let all the heat out." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Up close, in the lamplight, she could see the exhaustion written into every line of his face. His eyes were gray, she noticed, the color of winter sky. "You can hang your coat on the peg there," she told him. He did, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned not to make sudden movements around skittish creatures. When he turned back, she gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." He sat. For a moment, neither of them moved. The stew steamed between them, rich with the smell of meat and potatoes and wild onions she'd gathered from the creek bank. Eliza watched him look at it, watched him swallow hard, watched his hands curl into fists on his thighs as though he were physically restraining himself from falling on the food like a starving dog. "Go ahead," she said quietly. He picked up the spoon with fingers that trembled slightly and took a bite. She saw him close his eyes, saw his throat work as he swallowed. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with something that might have been relief or gratitude or simple human exhaustion so deep it had no name. "This is good," he said, his voice rough. "Real good. Thank you." Eliza nodded and began eating her own portion. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against bowls and the pop and hiss of the fire. He didn't rush, didn't gulp it down, though she could tell he wanted to. Instead, he ate with the same careful control he'd shown with his horse, and she found herself respecting that restraint. When his bowl was empty, he tore off a piece of bread and used it to soak up the last of the gravy. She refilled his bowl without asking, and he looked at her with something like wonder. "You sure you can spare it?" "I'm sure." He ate the second bowl more slowly, and some of the hollow look began to leave his face. By the time he finished, full dark had fallen outside, and the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters. Eliza rose and lit a second lamp, then poured coffee from the pot she kept warming on the edge of the stove. "I don't have sugar," she said, setting a cup before him. "Don't need it." They drank their coffee in the same silence they'd shared the meal. Eliza found it oddly comfortable, this quietness. Most people felt the need to fill every pause with words, as though silence itself were something to fear. But this man, Caleb, he'd said his name was, he seemed content to simply be. Finally, he set down his cup and met her eyes. "I appreciate the meal, Miss Hartwell." Eliza Hartwell. "Miss Hartwell, I appreciate the meal. And the water for my horse. I'll be out of your way come morning." "Where will you go?" He hesitated. "I'll find some place to camp down by the creek. Don't want to trouble you further." Eliza looked at him, really looked at him, at the way he held himself so carefully, as though afraid of taking up too much space, at the worn-through elbows of his shirt and the dust ground so deep into the fabric it would never wash clean, at the hands wrapped around the coffee cup, scarred and calloused and strong. "There's a storm coming," she said. "You can feel it in the air." "I've slept through worse." "I don't doubt it. But my barn's got a dry loft and there's clean straw up there. You're welcome to it if you want." He studied her face, searching for what? Pity? Charity? Some hidden motive? She met his gaze steadily and let him look his fill. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why what? Why offer? You don't know me. I could be anyone." "That's true," Eliza acknowledged. "But I figure a man who takes that kind of care with his horse probably isn't the type to murder a woman in her sleep." A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh, though it was rusty with disuse. "That's a hell of a way to judge character." "You have a better method?" He considered this. "No," he admitted. "Reckon I don't." "Then we're agreed. You'll sleep in the barn tonight, and come morning you can decide whether you're still heading for Yellowstone or if you've got the sense to ask for proper directions first." This time the laugh was fuller, and it changed his whole face, made him look younger, less burdened. "Yes, ma'am." He stood, gathering his hat from where he'd left it on the peg by the door. At the threshold he paused and looked back at her. "Miss Hartwell, I want you to know I'm grateful for the meal and the shelter both. It's been a while since anyone showed me kindness without wanting something in return. Then you've been keeping company with the wrong sort of people." "Story of my life," he said quietly, and then he was gone, pulling the door shut behind him with a care that suggested he knew what it meant to close a door gently on a quiet house. Eliza sat alone in the lamplight, listening to the wind rise and the first fat drops of rain begin to fall. She should have felt uneasy, having a strange man so close, should have spent the night with the rifle beside her bed, jumping at every sound. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. She felt curious. Teet. Rain hammered the roof all night, a sound like 1,000 fingers drumming on wood. Eliza lay in her narrow bed and listened to it, thinking about the man in her barn, wondering if the roof out there still leaked where she hadn't gotten around to patching it, wondering if he was cold, if he was dry, if he was sleeping or lying awake the way she was, staring into darkness and thinking thoughts that circled like crows. Morning came gray and wet, the kind of dawn that never quite commits to full light. Eliza rose and dressed in the chill air, braided her hair, started the fire. She made coffee and cornmeal mush, fried eggs from her hens, sliced more of yesterday's bread, set out 2 plates without quite knowing why she bothered. For all she knew, he'd already left, slipped away in the pre-dawn darkness like a ghost who'd never been there at all. But when she opened the door to throw out the dishwater, she saw him. He was working on her fence. Eliza stood on the porch in the drizzle, watching as Caleb Rowan drove a new post into the ground where the old one had rotted through. He'd found her tools somehow, the post hole digger, the hammer, the nails, and he worked with the efficient economy of motion that spoke of long practice. His coat was dark with rain, his hair plastered to his skull, but he didn't stop. Didn't even seem to notice the weather. She watched him tamp the earth firm around the base of the post, watched him test its sturdiness with both hands, watched him nod to himself in satisfaction before moving to the next section that needed work. "What are you doing?" she called. He looked up, squinting through the rain. "Morning, Miss Hartwell. Hope I didn't wake you." "You didn't answer my question." He straightened, brushing mud from his hands. "Noticed this fence was in rough shape. Thought I'd make some repairs before I moved on. Payment for the meal and the shelter." "I didn't ask for payment." "I know. but I don't like taking without giving. Eliza came down off the porch, ignoring the rain that immediately began soaking through her dress. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, but I'd feel better about it if I could do something useful before I go. He met her eyes, and she saw in them a kind of quiet pride that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with a man's need to feel he'd earned his place, however briefly, in the world. She understood that, had felt it herself every time someone in town looked at her with pity and offered help she hadn't asked for. The assumption that she couldn't manage on her own, that she needed rescuing, that a woman alone was by definition a woman in need. All right, she said, but come inside first and eat. You'll work better on a full stomach. Yes, ma'am. Inside, he hung his dripping coat by the fire to dry and sat at the table with his hands folded, waiting. Eliza served him eggs and mush and coffee and watched him eat with that same careful restraint. This morning, though, she ate with him, and she found herself studying his face in the gray light coming through the window. He had a good face, she decided. Honest, the kind of face that didn't know how to lie, even when lying might serve him better. There was a scar through his left eyebrow, another along his jaw. His nose had been broken at least once, the marks of a hard life, but not a cruel one. How long have you been on the road? She asked. He looked up from his plate, surprised by the question. Near about 4 years now. That's a long time to be drifting. Is it? He considered this. I suppose it is. Doesn't feel long when you're living it. One day just sort of bleeds into the next. Where did you start? Missouri. Had a farm there once. His voice went flat, carefully neutral. Lost it. Eliza didn't press. She knew about losing things. Knew how some losses were too large to talk about. How they sat in your chest like stones. And the only way to bear them was to build walls around them and never, ever look directly at what you'd locked away. You were a farmer then, she said instead. Among other things. He took a sip of coffee. Did some soldiering before that. Some cowboying after. Worked in a sawmill for a while. Broke horses for a ranch outside Denver. Spent a winter trapping up in the Wind Rivers. Turns out I'm pretty good at most things, as long as they don't require staying in one place too long. Why not? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Too direct, too personal. She expected him to deflect, to change the subject, to retreat behind the careful courtesy he'd shown since arriving. Instead, he met her eyes and said simply, Because I don't deserve to. The words hung in the air between them, stark and terrible in their honesty. Eliza felt something twist in her chest. Recognition, maybe, or kinship. She knew about not deserving things, knew about the voice that whispered in the dark hours that happiness was for other people. That peace was something you'd forfeited through failures you couldn't name but couldn't forget. That's a hard way to live, she said quietly. It's the only way I know. They finished breakfast in silence, and then Caleb went back out into the rain. Eliza watched him through the window as he worked, moving from one repair to the next with methodical determination. He fixed the fence, patched a hole in the chicken coop where a fox had tried to dig through, rehung the barn door that had been sagging on its hinges since winter. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only when she brought him water and made him rest. You don't have to do all this, she said, handing him the dipper. I know. He drank deeply, water running down his chin. But I want to. Why? He handed the dipper back and looked at her homestead. The cabin, the garden, the animals, the land stretching away to the mountains. Because it matters, he said. What you're doing here, building something, making it last, that matters. And I haven't done anything that mattered in a long time. Eliza felt her throat tighten. You don't know anything about me. Maybe I don't deserve it either. Maybe not, he agreed. But I figure if you didn't, you wouldn't still be here. You'd have given up and gone back to wherever you came from. Instead, you're fighting to make this work. That tells me everything I need to know. He went back to work before she could respond, and she stood there in the rain, watching him and feeling something shift inside her chest. Something that felt dangerously like hope. By evening, the rain had stopped and the sun broke through in long golden shafts that turned the wet grass to fire. Eliza cooked dinner, fried potatoes and salt pork, and the last of the carrots from her winter stores, and when she called Caleb in to eat, he came without argument. They ate together again, and this time the silence felt different. Less like two strangers sharing space, and more like two people who'd found an unexpected comfort in each other's company. "How long have you been alone out here?" Caleb asked. 2 years, since my father died. No other family? None that matters. My mother passed when I was young. There's an aunt in Ohio, but we don't speak. She pushed potatoes around her plate. Everyone thought I'd sell the homestead and move to town, live with some charitable family, work as a seamstress or a school teacher, be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they wanted to offer me. But you stayed. I stayed. Why? Eliza looked at him across the table, at this man who'd appeared out of nowhere and somehow, in the space of a single day, made her want to tell the truth. "Because it's mine," she said. "My father built this place with his own hands, broke his back making something out of nothing. When he got sick, I nursed him through it. When he died, I buried him on that hill over there under the cottonwoods. This land has my blood and sweat and tears in it. I'll be damned if I'm going to give it up, just because people think a woman can't manage alone." "Can you manage alone?" "I have so far." "That's not what I asked." She met his eyes, saw the challenge there. Not mockery, not doubt, just honest curiosity, the question of someone who genuinely wanted to know. "Barely," she admitted. "Some days I barely manage at all. But barely is enough. Barely keeps me fed and the roof over my head and the land in my name. Barely means I don't have to bend my neck to anyone or explain myself or pretend to be grateful for a life I never wanted." Caleb nodded slowly. "I understand that." "Do you?" "More than you might think." He leaned back in his chair, hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "After the war, I tried to go back to the farm. Tried to pick up where I'd left off, like 4 years of killing hadn't changed anything. But it had. Changed me, changed the land, changed what I thought I was owed from life. I couldn't make it work. Couldn't make myself care enough to try, so I walked away. And you've been walking ever since." "Yes." "Do you regret it?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "Every day," he said finally. "But I don't know how to stop." Eliza felt something crack open inside her, some carefully guarded place she'd kept locked for 2 years. "Maybe you don't have to stop," she said softly. "Maybe you just have to slow down long enough to catch your breath." He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the same desperate, fragile hope she felt blooming in her own chest, the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could be less alone. "How long can I stay?" he asked. The question should have frightened her, should have sent her reaching for the rifle, reminded her of all the reasons why letting a strange man stay was dangerous and foolish, and the kind of choice that led to ruin. Instead, she heard herself say, "As long as you want." One day became 2, then 3. Caleb slept in the barn and worked from dawn until dusk, finding things to fix, to build, to improve. He was good with his hands, quick to see what needed doing and how to do it efficiently. He repaired the well cover, replaced missing shingles on the cabin roof, built a new gate for the chicken run that actually latched properly. And Eliza, despite every instinct that told her to keep her distance, found herself drawn to his company. They fell into a rhythm. She would cook breakfast and call him in to eat. They would work together through the morning, him on the heavier labor, her in the garden or with the animals. At midday, she would bring him water, and they would rest in the shade of the cottonwoods, talking or not talking, both equally comfortable. Evening would find them at the table again, sharing the day's second meal and the kind of conversation that came easier in lamplight. He told her about the war, though not in the way most men did. He didn't talk about battles or glory or the rightness of the cause. Instead, he talked about the cold, the hunger, the boys who'd died calling for their mothers. He talked about coming home to Missouri and finding that the farm had been sold for taxes, that his wife had left him for a man who'd had the good sense not to enlist, that the world had moved on without him and didn't care to make room for what he'd become. "I wasn't a good husband," he said one night, staring into the fire. "Even before I left, I wasn't what she needed. The war just made it obvious to both of us." "Did you love her?" "I thought I did, but I was 19 and she was pretty, and love seemed like the kind of thing that just happened, like rain or seasons changing. I didn't understand that it was something you had to work at, something you had to choose every day. He looked at Eliza. Do you think it's possible to learn how to love right? Or are some people just born knowing? I don't know, she said honestly. I've never been in love. His eyebrows rose. Never? Never. There was a boy when I was 17, the blacksmith's son. He asked my father's permission to court me, and my father said yes, but then he died in a horse accident before anything came of it. After that, I was busy helping my father with the homestead. And then he got sick, and then he died, and here I am. 26 years old, and I've never been courted, never been kissed, never... She stopped, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Never what? Never had anyone look at me the way you're looking at me right now. The words hung between them, dangerous and true. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, an intensity, a focus that made her breath catch. How am I looking at you? He asked quietly. Like I matter. He stood slowly and crossed to where she sat by the fire. Knelt down so they were eye to eye. You do matter, Eliza. Anyone who can't see that is a damn fool. She wanted to look away, to retreat behind the walls she'd built so carefully, but his eyes held hers, gray and steady and full of a tenderness she hadn't known she'd been starving for. I don't know what I'm doing, she whispered. Neither do I. I'm frightened. So am I. Then what do we do? Caleb reached up and gently, so gently, touched her face. His fingers were rough with calluses, but his touch was careful, reverent, as though she were something precious that might break. We start slow, he said. No pressure, no rush. We just see what happens. If that's all right with you. Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. Good. He stood and held out his hand. Come walk with me. She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. They walked out into the night, under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The air smelled of sage and rain-scrubbed earth and possibility. They walked to the creek and stood listening to the water, shoulders touching, hands still linked. I want to stay, Caleb said, not just for a few days, for longer, if you'll have me. Why? Because I'm tired, Eliza. Tired of running, tired of feeling like I don't deserve to stand still. And when I'm here, when I'm with you, I feel like maybe I could stop. Maybe I could be the kind of man who stays. She turned to face him fully, searching his face in the starlight. I don't want promises you can't keep. I'm not making promises. I'm just asking for a chance. To do what? To see if two people who barely know how to live with themselves can learn to live with each other. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. That's the saddest, most honest thing anyone's ever said to me. Is that a yes? She looked at this man, the stranger who'd appeared at her gate asking for nothing more than water and had somehow, impossibly, become someone she couldn't imagine watching leave. Yes, she said. Stay. His smile was slow and wondering, like sunrise. Thank you. They stood there in the darkness, hands linked, two people who'd found each other in the loneliest corners of their lives, and decided to take the terrifying leap of not being alone. And when Caleb finally led her back to the cabin, when he touched his hat brim and said goodnight and walked to the barn, Eliza went to bed feeling something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she might actually have a future worth living. The days lengthened into weeks. Spring deepened into summer, and the homestead transformed under their shared labor. The garden Eliza had struggled to maintain alone began to flourish with Caleb's help. Neat rows of beans and squash and tomatoes, ambitious borders of sunflowers that turned their faces to follow the sun. The cabin got a new floor, proper planks instead of packed earth, and Caleb built shelves and a cupboard and a bench by the door for removing muddy boots. They worked side by side, and slowly, tentatively, they learned each other. Eliza discovered that Caleb sang while he worked, old army songs, hymns he'd learned as a child, melodies with no words that he hummed under his breath. That he was left-handed and hated coffee that had gone cold and had a horror of enclosed spaces that dated back to a week he'd spent trapped in a collapsed mine shaft during the war. That he could fix almost anything but had no patience for cooking and would eat the same meal 3 times a day if she let him. Caleb learned that Eliza talked to her chickens and had names for all of them, that she read her father's books over and over because she couldn't afford new ones, that she'd taught herself to shoot by practicing on fence posts until she could hit the same knot 10 times in a row, that she was stronger than she looked and more stubborn than anyone he'd ever met, and that she smiled so rarely. When she did, it felt like a gift. They learned to work in tandem, anticipating what the other needed, learned the comfortable rhythms of shared meals and evening conversations, learned that silence between them was never empty, but full of things that didn't need saying. But they were careful with each other too. Careful not to presume, not to push, not to ask for more than the other was ready to give. Until one evening in early July, when the heat had driven them down to the creek after supper. They sat on the bank with their feet in the water, watching the light fade from the sky, and Eliza said, "Tell me something true." Caleb looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Something true about yourself. Something you don't usually say out loud." He was quiet for a long moment, trailing his fingers through the current. "I'm afraid," he said finally. "All the time. Afraid I'll ruin this. Afraid I'll wake up one morning and the urge to run will be stronger than the reasons to stay. Afraid that I'm not the man you think I am." "What kind of man do I think you are?" "Someone good. Someone worth believing in." Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder. "You are those things." "You can't know that. You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you work hard and you're honest and you're kind. I know you gentle your horse and fix things that are broken, and you haven't once made me feel like I need saving." She paused. "And I know you're still here. That matters more than you think." Caleb wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they sat like that while the stars came out and the creek sang its endless song. After a while, he said, "Your turn. Tell me something true." Eliza took a breath. "I'm afraid too. Afraid of wanting this too much, afraid of what it'll feel like if you leave. And I'm afraid—" She stopped, feeling foolish. "Afraid of what?" "That I've waited so long for something like this that I won't know how to do it right. How to be with someone. How to let someone be with me." Caleb turned to look at her, and in the darkness his eyes were serious. "There's no right way, Eliza. There's just two people trying their best not to hurt each other." "Is that enough?" "I don't know, but it's what we have." She nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. Then, before she could lose her nerve, she said, "Will you kiss me?" She felt him go still. "Are you sure? I'm tired of being careful. I'm tired of being afraid. I want—" Her voice caught. "I want to know what it feels like. With you." Caleb reached up and cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "We can stop any time you want." "I know." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to pull away. But Eliza didn't move, didn't breathe. And when his lips finally met hers, soft and questioning and infinitely gentle, she felt something inside her break open, some locked room she'd kept sealed against loneliness and loss, and the terrible weight of doing everything alone. The kiss was brief, barely a whisper of contact, but when they pulled apart, Eliza was shaking. "All right?" Caleb asked softly. She nodded, unable to speak. He gathered her against his chest and held her while she trembled, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring nonsense words of comfort. And Eliza, who hadn't cried when her father died, who hadn't let herself cry through 2 years of struggle and solitude, finally let the tears come. "I'm sorry," she gasped against his shirt. "Don't be. Don't ever be sorry for feeling things. It's just, I didn't know. I didn't know it could be like that." "Like what?" "Like coming home." Caleb's arms tightened around her, and she felt him press his face into her hair. They stayed like that until her tears subsided, until the trembling eased, until she could breathe normally again. Then Caleb pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumbs wiping away the wetness on her cheeks. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not unless you tell me to go." "Do you promise?" "No, because I learned a long time ago that promises are just words, and words are cheap. But I can give you this. Every morning I choose to stay, I'll choose it because I want to, not out of obligation or habit, or because I don't know what else to do. I'll stay because being here with you is the first thing that's made sense to me in 4 years." Eliza searched his face, saw the truth written there in every line in shadow. "That's better than a promise," she whispered. "Is it?" "Yes, because it's real." He kissed her again, longer this time, deeper, and Eliza let herself fall into it. Let herself stop thinking and analyzing and protecting herself from hurt that might never come. Let herself simply feel, his hands in her hair, his breath against her skin, the solid warmth of him anchoring her to earth. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "We should go back to the cabin." "Why?" "Because if we don't, I'm going to forget how to be a gentleman, and I think we should probably take this slow." Eliza laughed, surprising herself. "I thought we agreed there's no right way to do this." "There isn't, but I don't want to rush you. Don't want you to wake up tomorrow and regret—" She stopped his words with another kiss, brief and fierce. "I won't regret this. Any of this. You can't know that. Neither can you. But we're going to find out together, aren't we?" Caleb smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Yeah," he said softly. "I guess we are." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and that night, for the first time, Eliza didn't sleep alone. Caleb moved his bedroll from the barn loft to the floor beside her bed, and they lay in the darkness talking until words gave way to drowsiness, and drowsiness gave way to sleep. And Eliza, drifting off with Caleb's voice in her ears, and his presence solid and real just a few feet away, thought that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found what she'd been looking for without even knowing she was searching. Someone to stand beside in the long Montana night. Someone to choose over and over until choosing became as natural as breathing. Someone to finally stop being alone with. The first real test came 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning when the sky hung heavy with the promise of rain that wouldn't fall. Eliza was in the garden, tying up tomato plants that had grown leggy in the heat, when she heard the rattle of a wagon on the road. She straightened, shading her eyes against the glare, and felt her stomach drop when she recognized the driver. Mrs. Pemberton from town, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, and beside her on the wagon seat, Reverend Walsh in his dusty black coat. "Company," Caleb said quietly. He'd come up beside her without her noticing, the way he sometimes did, moving with the silent grace of someone who'd learned to walk softly in dangerous places. "You want me to make myself scarce?" Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, watching the wagon draw closer. "No, you live here now. You don't have to hide. Living here and living here are two different things, and we both know it." She looked at him, at the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "I don't care what they think." "Maybe you should." "Why? So they can feel better about their judgments? So they can go back to town and tell everyone that poor Eliza Hartwell finally came to her senses and sent that drifter packing?" She shook her head. "I'm done living my life according to what other people think is proper." Caleb's expression softened. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." The wagon pulled up to the gate, and Mrs. Pemberton climbed down with the ponderous dignity of a woman who considered herself the arbiter of social standards in a town too small to have many. She was perhaps 50, thick through the middle, with a face that had settled into permanent lines of disapproval. The Reverend followed more slowly, a thin man with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge others harshly, though his profession demanded he try. "Miss Hartwell." "Mrs." Pemberton called, her voice carrying the particular brightness that preceded unpleasant conversations. "What a lovely surprise to find you at home." Eliza walked to meet them, Caleb a step behind. "Mrs. Pemberton? Reverend, this is unexpected. We were passing by on our way back from the Morrison place, their new baby, such a blessing. And I said to Reverend Walsh, we simply must stop and check on dear Eliza. It's been so long since we've seen her in town." Mrs. Pemberton's gaze slid past Eliza to Caleb, and her smile took on a brittle quality. "I see you have a visitor." "Not a visitor. Caleb Rowan. He's helping with the homestead." "Is he now?" Mrs. Pemberton's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "How industrious! And where exactly is Mr. Rowan staying, if I might ask?" The implication was clear as glass. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. not from shame, but from anger at the presumption. That's none of your concern, Mrs. Pemberton. Oh, but it is, dear. When a young woman of good family is living alone with a strange man, it becomes the concern of the entire community. We have standards to maintain, you understand, propriety to uphold. Caleb stepped forward, hat in hand, his voice carefully neutral. Ma'am, I assure you there's nothing improper about the arrangement. I sleep in the barn, and Miss Hartwell sleeps in the cabin, and there's never been any suggestion of the barn. Mrs. Pemberton's laugh was like breaking glass. Well, that's something, I suppose, though I hardly think it matters where you sleep when you're both— She stopped herself, pressed a hand to her bosom. Forgive me. I'm only thinking of Miss Hartwell's reputation. Once damaged, you know, it can never be fully restored. Reverend Walsh cleared his throat. Perhaps we might speak more charitably, Mrs. Pemberton. I'm sure Miss Hartwell and Mr. Rowan understand the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. Do they? Mrs. Pemberton turned her attention back to Eliza, and her voice dropped to something almost gentle, which was somehow worse than her earlier sharpness. My dear girl, I know you've been struggling out here alone. It's only natural that you might be vulnerable to certain temptations. A man offers help, offers company, and before you know it, you've made choices that can't be unmade. I'm here as a friend, as someone who cares about your welfare, to urge you to consider what you're doing. Send this man on his way before it's too late. Come back to town where decent people can look after you properly. Eliza felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Pemberton, but I don't need looking after. I'm managing just fine. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're making the same mistakes your mother made. The words landed like a slap. Eliza went very still. What did you say? Mrs. Pemberton had the grace to look uncomfortable, but she pressed on. Your mother, God rest her soul, she was a headstrong girl too. Married your father against her family's wishes, ran off to this wilderness, and died young because she wouldn't listen to reason. I would hate to see you follow the same path. My mother died in childbirth, Eliza said, her voice shaking. That had nothing to do with being headstrong or not listening to reason. That was just life and death, the way it happens out here. Perhaps, but if she'd stayed in Ohio, stayed near her family, there would have been doctors, proper care. There are no guarantees, Mrs. Pemberton. Not in Ohio, not anywhere. My mother made her choice and she lived with it, and I'm making mine. By shacking up with some drifter who'll be gone the moment something better comes along? Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Didn't defend himself. Just stood there with his hat in his hands and let the accusations wash over him like he'd heard them all before and knew there was no point in arguing. Mr. Rowan is not some drifter, Eliza said, her voice steady now, cold. He's a decent man who's worked harder in the past month than anyone in town has worked all year. He's helped me make repairs I couldn't have managed alone. He's asked for nothing but food and shelter, and he's treated me with more respect than you're showing right now. Respect. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth twisted. Is that what we're calling it? Yes, that's exactly what we're calling it. Eliza stepped forward, closing the distance between them. You want to know the truth, Mrs. Pemberton? The truth is I like having him here. I like not being alone. I like having someone to talk to at supper and someone to share the work with and someone who looks at me like I'm a person worth knowing instead of a charity case to be pitied. And if that offends your sense of propriety, if that damages my reputation beyond repair, then so be it. I'd rather be ruined and happy than proper and lonely. Mrs. Pemberton's face flushed an unbecoming red. Well, I can see there's no reasoning with you. Reverend, I think we've wasted enough time here. But Reverend Walsh didn't move. He was looking at Eliza with those kind, sad eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. Miss Hartwell, I understand your position. Truly, I do. Loneliness is a terrible burden, and I don't fault you for seeking companionship. But I must urge you to consider the practical consequences of your choices. A woman's reputation, once lost, affects not just her own prospects, but those of any children she might have. If you and Mr. Rowan if there's genuine affection between you, then perhaps the proper course would be to formalize the arrangement. Marriage would silence the gossips and protect you both from speculation. Eliza felt her face go hot. It's not like that. Isn't it? The Reverend's gaze was knowing but not unkind. Forgive me, but I've been ministering to frontier families for 20 years. I know the signs of two people who care for each other. There's no shame in it, Miss Hartwell, but there are right ways and wrong ways to go about these things. What the Reverend is trying to say, Mrs. Pemberton interjected, her voice dripping with false sweetness, is that if you insist on keeping this man around, the least you can do is marry him. Make an honest arrangement of it. Otherwise, you'll be seen as, well, we needn't spell it out, need we? Eliza looked at Caleb and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. We haven't discussed marriage, she said quietly. Then perhaps you should, Reverend Walsh said, before circumstances make the decision for you. The implication hung in the air, ugly and inescapable. Before you find yourself with child. Before the choice is taken away entirely. Before the whole town knows what you've been doing in the dark. I think it's time you left, Eliza said, her voice hard. Mrs. Pemberton sniffed. We came here out of Christian charity, Miss Hartwell, to help you avoid a terrible mistake. If you're too stubborn to accept that help, then the consequences are on your own head. I'll live with the consequences, just as I've lived with everything else. The two visitors climbed back onto their wagon, Mrs. Pemberton radiating righteous indignation, the Reverend looking troubled and sad. As they drove away, Eliza stood in the yard with her arms wrapped around herself, feeling like she'd been stripped naked and examined and found wanting. Caleb moved beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Are you all right? No. Want to talk about it? No. They stood in silence, watching dust rise from the departing wagon. Finally, Caleb said, They're not entirely wrong, you know. Eliza turned to look at him. About what? About this being complicated. About people talking. About the fact that we're not exactly following the rules. I don't care about the rules. Maybe you should. Maybe we both should. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. I don't want to be the reason you lose your standing in the community. Don't want to be the reason people look at you differently. They already look at me differently. I'm the woman who refused to be sensible and sell her dead father's homestead. I'm the spinster who lives alone and doesn't go to church and won't accept help from the good Christian ladies who want to save me from myself. One more reason for them to disapprove won't make much difference. It might, if you ever want to... He stopped, started again. If you ever want to have a normal life, a family, children, those things are harder when you're considered ruined? She laughed, but it came out bitter. Let me tell you something about being ruined, Caleb. I was ruined the day my father died and left me alone. Ruined when I chose to stay on this land instead of going back to Ohio with my tail between my legs. Ruined when I decided I'd rather break my back doing work meant for a man than smile and simper and hope some farmer would take pity on me and offer marriage. I've been ruined for years by every standard that matters to people like Mrs. Pemberton. Having you here doesn't change that. It just gives them a new excuse to cluck their tongues and shake their heads and feel superior. Caleb was quiet for a moment. And marriage? What she said about making it official? Eliza's heart gave a painful lurch. Is that what you want? I'm asking what you want. I don't know. She turned away, staring at the mountains in the distance. I don't know anything anymore. A month ago, I was alone and I'd made my peace with it. Now you're here and everything's different, and I can't think straight because all I know is I don't want you to leave. But marriage, that's not something to rush into just because the Reverend thinks we should, or because Mrs. Pemberton wants to protect my virtue. No, Caleb agreed. It's not. Do you want to marry me? The question hung between them, stark and terrifying. Caleb looked at her with those gray eyes that saw too much. I want to deserve you, he said finally. I want to be the kind of man who could stand up in front of a preacher and make promises and know he could keep them. But I don't know if I am. I don't know if I'll wake up one morning and feel that old restlessness and need to run. And if we're married, if we've made it legal and binding, and I can't fight that urge, what then? I'd rather walk away now while you can still hate me cleanly than stay and ruin both our lives. Eliza felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. So that's it? We just stop? Because of what Mrs. Pemberton said? No, God, no. Caleb reached for her hands, gripped them tight. I'm not stopping anything. I'm just saying we should be honest about what this is and what it might become. I care about you, Eliza. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time. But caring isn't the same as being able to stay, and I need you to understand that. I do understand. I've understood from the beginning. She met his eyes. You think I didn't know what I was getting into? You think I didn't see exactly what you are? A man who doesn't know how to put down roots? Who spent 4 years running from ghosts I can't fight for you? I knew. I know. And I chose to let you stay anyway. Why? Because I'm tired of being safe. Tired of protecting myself from every possible hurt. Tired of living small just to make sure I never get my heart broken. She pulled her hands free and cupped his face between them, forcing him to look at her. I'd rather have you for whatever time you're willing to give than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to try. Caleb closed his eyes, leaned into her touch. You're going to destroy me. Probably. But you're going to save me first, so I figure we're even. He opened his eyes, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Fear and hope and desperate, aching need all tangled together. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I. But we're learning, aren't we? Are we? Yes. She pulled his face down to hers and kissed him, hard and certain, pouring into it all the things she didn't have words for. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she said, Stay. Please. Not because I'm asking you to marry me, or because the Reverend thinks we should, or because Mrs. Pemberton will talk. Stay because you want to, because you're not ready to leave yet, because we're not finished. And when we are, when I wake up and the leaving is stronger than the staying, then you leave and I'll let you go. No accusations, no blame. You'll just go and I'll stay here and we'll both have to live with it. Caleb searched her face. You make it sound simple. It is simple. It's just not easy. He laughed, a sound caught between pain and wonder. No, it's sure as hell not easy. They stood there in the yard holding each other while the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot around them. Eventually, Caleb said, I should get back to work. That fence by the north pasture won't fix itself. I'll help. You don't have to. I know, but I want to. They worked together through the heat of the day, side by side, not talking much but moving in the synchronized rhythm they'd developed over weeks of shared labor. And when evening came and they sat down to supper, everything was the same and everything was different, because now they both knew exactly what they were choosing and what it might cost them. That night, after the dishes were washed and put away, Caleb didn't go to the barn. He stood by the door, uncertain, and Eliza held out her hand. Stay, she said simply. Eliza, not like that, just stay, sleep here. I'm tired of you being so far away. He took her hand and let her lead him to the bed. They lay down together, fully clothed, and she turned her back to him so he could wrap his arms around her. She felt him press his face into her hair, felt his breath warm against her neck, felt the solid weight of him behind her like an anchor in rough seas. Thank you, he whispered. For what? For not giving up on me. Eliza laced her fingers through his. We're not giving up on each other, that's the whole point. She felt him nod, and then there were no more words. Just the two of them breathing in the darkness, holding on and hoping it would be enough. The days that followed fell into a new pattern. Caleb still did most of the heavy work, but now they tackled projects together, building a proper smokehouse, digging a second well closer to the garden, reinforcing the barn foundation. They worked in easy companionship, speaking when they needed to and silent when they didn't, and every night they slept in the same bed, wrapped around each other like they were afraid of floating away if they let go. Eliza found herself watching him at odd moments, when he was chopping wood and the sun caught the swing of the axe, when he was bent over some repair with his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration, when he stood at the edge of the property at dusk and looked out at the mountains with an expression of longing so deep it hurt to witness. She wondered what he was thinking in those moments, wondered if he was calculating distances, measuring the pull of horizons against the weight of staying. But he never said anything about leaving, never even hinted at it. Instead, he threw himself into making the homestead better, stronger, more capable of weathering whatever storms might come. He built with the fierce concentration of a man trying to outrun his own demons through sheer physical labor. One evening in late July, they were sitting by the creek after supper when Caleb said, "Tell me about your father." Eliza looked up from the piece of harness she was mending. "What do you want to know?" "What he was like, why he came out here, what he wanted from this place." She set the harness aside, thinking. He was stubborn. That's the first thing you need to know about him. Once he got an idea in his head, nothing could shake it loose. My mother's family tried to talk him out of homesteading, told him he was throwing away a good position in Ohio for a foolish dream. But he'd read about other territories, about all this land just waiting for someone brave enough to claim it, and he couldn't let it go. "What about your mother? Did she want to come?" "I think she wanted to be with him more than she wanted anything else. She was young, only 18 when they married, still thought love was enough to overcome any hardship." Eliza smiled sadly. Maybe it was, for her. She died believing they'd done the right thing. "And you? Do you think they did the right thing?" "I think they did the only thing they could. My father needed this land the way some people need air. Without it, he would have withered and died inside, even if his body kept on living. My mother understood that. She chose to follow him, knowing it might kill her, because the alternative was watching the man she loved slowly suffocate in a life that didn't fit him." Caleb was quiet, trailing his fingers through the water. "That's a hell of a burden to carry, knowing someone died for a choice you made. Is that how it felt after the war, after your wife left?" He nodded slowly. "I didn't die in that war. Came close a few times, but I lived when better men didn't. And then I came home, and my wife looked at me like I was a stranger, like the man she'd married had died at Shiloh or Gettysburg, and some hollow thing had taken his place. She wasn't wrong. I did die out there, in all the ways that matter. I just didn't have the decency to stop breathing." "You're not hollow." "How do you know?" "Because hollow men don't sing while they work. Hollow men don't gentle their horses or fix things that are broken or stay up half the night talking about everything and nothing. You're hurt, Caleb. You're damaged, but you're not hollow." He looked at her then, and in his eyes she saw something raw and grateful and afraid. "I want to believe you." "Then believe me." She moved closer, resting her head against his shoulder. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm not asking you to stop carrying the weight of it. I'm just asking you to believe that you're more than the worst thing you've ever done or seen or survived. You're more than your mistakes." "So are you," he said softly. "What mistakes have I made?" "None yet, but you're about to. Getting tangled up with me. That's a mistake you're making with your eyes wide open." Eliza smiled against his shoulder. "Then it's not really a mistake, is it? It's a choice." "Semantics." "No, it matters. A mistake is something you didn't mean to do. A choice is something you own, even when it hurts." She pulled back to look at him. "I'm choosing this. Choosing you. And if it ends badly, if you wake up tomorrow and decide you need to leave, I'll still have chosen it. I'll still be glad I did." Caleb cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "You're the bravest person I've ever met. I'm terrified." "I know. That's what makes it brave." He kissed her then, slow and deep and thorough, and Eliza felt something inside her chest crack open wider, spilling light into places that had been dark for so long she'd forgotten they existed. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," he whispered. "You showed up at my gate asking for water, that's all. Just showed up and stayed. That's all? That's everything." They sat by the creek until the stars came out, talking and kissing and holding each other, and when they finally walked back to the cabin hand in hand, Eliza felt something she'd almost given up on. She felt like maybe the universe hadn't entirely forgotten her, like maybe there was still room in her life for joy. The storm came 3 days later, fierce and sudden the way summer storms do in the mountains. The sky turned green-black in the space of an hour, and the wind picked up until it screamed through the cottonwoods like something wounded. Eliza and Caleb rushed to secure the animals, get everything under cover, batten down what could be battened, and pray the rest would hold. They barely made it back to the cabin before the rain hit, coming down in sheets so thick Eliza couldn't see the barn from the porch. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled across the valley like artillery fire, and she saw Caleb flinch at every crash, saw him go somewhere else in his head, somewhere dark and full of smoke and screaming. "Hey," she said, taking his hand. "You're here. You're safe. It's just a storm." But his eyes were distant, unfocused, and she knew he wasn't seeing the cabin anymore. He was seeing battlefields, seeing friends cut down by cannon fire, seeing things she couldn't imagine and prayed she never would. "Caleb." She gripped his hand tighter, pulled him toward the bed. "Come here. Lie down with me." He let her guide him, moving like a man in a dream. She pulled him down onto the mattress and wrapped herself around him, holding him tight, while the storm raged and his body shook with tremors he couldn't control. She whispered nonsense in his ear, stroked his hair, pressed her face against his neck, and just held on. Eventually, the trembling subsided. The storm passed, leaving behind clean air and dripping silence. Caleb's breathing evened out, and she thought he might have fallen asleep, but then he spoke, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For being broken." "You're not broken. You're human." She kissed his temple. "And even if you were broken, I wouldn't care. Broken things can still be beautiful, can still work, can still matter." He turned in her arms to face her, and in the gray light filtering through the window, she could see tear tracks on his face. "I killed people in that war. Men I didn't know, didn't have any quarrel with. Boys, some of them. Younger than I was, I can still see their faces sometimes." "I know." "How can you stand to be near me, knowing what I've done?" "Because what you did doesn't define what you are. You were a soldier. You followed orders. You survived. That's not the same as being a murderer." "Isn't it?" "No." She said it firmly, without hesitation. "Murder is personal. It's deliberate. It's killing because you want to, because you choose cruelty over mercy. War is—" She struggled for words. "War is hell. It's chaos. It's doing terrible things because the alternative is dying yourself. You don't get to carry the weight of every life you took when you were just trying to stay alive. Someone has to carry it. Then carry it. But don't let it convince you that you're beyond redemption. Don't let it poison every good thing you might still have." Caleb searched her face. "How are you so sure?" "I'm not, but I'm choosing to believe in you anyway." That's what love is, isn't it? Choosing to believe in someone even when you can't be sure. The word hung between them, stark and huge. Love. She'd said it without meaning to, without thinking, and now it was out there and she couldn't take it back. "Eliza," Caleb breathed. "I know, it's too soon. We barely know each other. I shouldn't—" He stopped her words with a kiss, fierce and desperate, and full of things he couldn't say. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. "I love you too," he whispered. "I think I've loved you since that first night when you offered me stew and didn't ask me to explain myself. I just didn't know if I was allowed to say it." "You're allowed." She kissed him again, softer this time. "You're allowed to feel things, Caleb. You're allowed to want things. You're allowed to be happy. I don't know how. Then we'll learn together." They held each other while the light faded and evening came on. And for the first time since he'd arrived at her gate, Caleb Rowan let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something worth staying for, something worth fighting his demons to keep, something worth calling home. The words changed everything and nothing at all. They still woke before dawn and worked until their hands were raw and their backs ached. Still ate simple meals at the rough-hewn table and talked about the weather, the animals, the 100 small concerns that filled their days. But now there was something beneath it all, running like an underground river. This knowledge that they loved each other, that they'd spoken it aloud and couldn't pretend otherwise. Eliza caught herself watching Caleb more openly now, no longer hiding the warmth in her gaze when he looked up from whatever task occupied his hands. And he touched her more freely, a hand at the small of her back when he passed behind her, fingers brushing hers when he handed her a tool, his arms settling around her shoulders when they sat by the fire in the evening. Small gestures, but they accumulated into something larger, something that felt like permanence, even though neither of them dared name it as such. August came in hot and dry, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned the grass brittle underfoot. The creek ran lower than Eliza had ever seen it, and she worried about the well, about the garden, about what would happen if the drought stretched into September. But Caleb seemed unconcerned, and his confidence steadied her. "We'll manage," he said one evening as they surveyed the drooping tomato plants. "Worst case, we haul water from the creek until the rains come. It's hard work, but we've done harder." "Have we?" He smiled, that slow warming of his face that still had the power to make her heart stutter. "You have. I've just been following your lead." "Liar. You've worked twice as hard as me since the day you arrived." "Maybe. But you're the one who knew what needed doing. I just did it." They hauled water together in the cool hours before dawn and after sunset, carrying buckets from the creek to the garden in a steady rhythm that left them both exhausted but strangely satisfied. There was something almost meditative about the work, the simple repetition of it, the way their bodies moved in sync without needing to coordinate. Fill, carry, pour, return. Over and over until the garden had drunk its fill and they could collapse on the porch steps, shoulders touching, too tired to do anything but breathe. "Tell me something," Eliza said one night as they sat there in the darkness, the smell of damp earth rising around them. "What do you want to know?" "What you think about. When you're working and your hands are busy but your mind is free, where does it go?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "It used to go backward, to the war, to Missouri, to all the things I lost or threw away or couldn't save. Every moment I wasn't forcing my mind to stay present, it would slip back into those old ruts and I'd be there again, living through it all over. And now? Now it goes forward." He turned to look at her, his face barely visible in the starlight. "I think about next spring and whether we should plant more wheat or stick with corn. I think about building a new chicken coop with proper nesting boxes and a door that actually latches. I think about fixing up the loft in the barn, making it into a real room instead of just loose straw and hope." He paused. "I think about staying." Eliza's throat tightened. "You do?" "Every day. Every hour, if I'm honest. It scares me half to death, but I can't seem to stop." "Why does it scare you?" "Because wanting something this much means it can be taken away, and I don't know if I could survive losing it." She took his hand, laced their fingers together. "Then don't lose it. Choose to stay. Choose it every day until choosing becomes as natural as breathing, and you can't remember what it felt like to always be leaving." "Is it that simple?" "No, but it's that important." They sat in silence after that, holding hands like children afraid of the dark, and overhead the stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. The town dance came in mid-August, an annual tradition that brought together homesteaders from 50 miles in every direction. Eliza usually avoided it. Too many pitying looks, too many well-meaning questions about when she was going to give up this foolish independence and accept that a woman needed a man to survive. But this year Caleb asked if she wanted to go, and something in his voice told her it mattered to him. "Why?" she asked. "You don't strike me as the dancing type." "I'm not. But I thought—" He looked uncomfortable, turning his hat in his hands. "I thought maybe it was time we stopped hiding, time people knew we were together." "We're not hiding, we're just not advertising." "Eliza." He set down the hat and took both her hands. "I know what people think. I know what Mrs. Pemberton said, and I know there are probably a dozen others saying the same things, that I'm taking advantage of you, that you're too naive to see what I really am, that we're living in sin and scandaling the whole territory. And maybe they're right about some of it. But I want them to see us together and know that this is real, that we chose each other and we're not ashamed of it." "I'm not ashamed. I know, but I am. A little. Not of you, never of you, but of letting you face their judgment alone, of sleeping in your bed every night but not being willing to stand beside you in public and claim you as mine." His jaw tightened. "If we go to that dance together, if we walk in side by side and dance where everyone can see, then there's no more speculation. No more wondering. They'll know. And you think that will make things better? I think it will make things honest. And I'm tired of living like we're doing something wrong when this is the most right thing I've done in my entire life." Eliza felt her eyes burn. "You really want to go to a town dance? With me? More than anything. Even though you can't dance?" A smile tugged at his mouth. Who says I can't dance? Can you? Well, no, but I'm willing to learn. She laughed, and it came out watery. All right, we'll go. But if you step on my feet, I reserve the right to leave you standing there looking foolish. Fair enough. They spent the next week preparing. Eliza had one good dress, a dark blue calico that had been her mother's, and she spent hours letting out the seams and taking in the waist until it fit properly. Caleb borrowed a razor from her father's things and shaved carefully, then trimmed his hair as best he could without a mirror. The night before the dance, they stood in the cabin looking at each other, and Eliza felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. What if they're cruel? She asked quietly. What if they say things that hurt you? Then they say things. Words can't break me, Eliza. Not anymore. The war used up all the words that could hurt. He crossed to her, tilted her chin up. But if they say things that hurt you, I might have to get in a fight. Fair warning. Caleb, I mean it. I can take whatever they want to throw at me, but I won't stand there and let them tear you down. Not when you're the strongest person in that whole damn territory. She kissed him, soft and brief. Just don't get yourself killed defending my honor. I'd hate to have to bury you before we've had a chance to dance. Yes, ma'am. The dance was held in the largest barn in the territory, belonging to a cattle rancher named Morrison, who'd done well enough to afford luxuries like a proper floor and windows with real glass. By the time Eliza and Caleb arrived, the place was already crowded with people in their Sunday best, the air thick with the smells of perfume and sweat, and the wild roses someone had scattered across the rafters. A hush fell when they walked in together. Eliza felt every eye turned toward them, felt the weight of speculation and judgment and barely concealed curiosity. Mrs. Pemberton stood near the refreshment table, her mouth pinched into a tight line of disapproval. Reverend Walsh looked troubled but not unkind. A cluster of young women whispered behind their hands, shooting Caleb appraising looks that made Eliza's jaw tighten. And the men looked at Caleb with the careful neutrality of those trying to decide if he was a threat or just another drifter passing through. Caleb seemed not to notice any of it. He kept his hand at the small of Eliza's back, steady and sure, and when the music started, he led her onto the floor without hesitation. I thought you couldn't dance, she whispered as he took her in his arms. I said I couldn't dance well, didn't say I couldn't do it at all. He was right. He wasn't particularly graceful, and he counted the steps under his breath in a way that would have been amusing if it weren't so endearing. But he was earnest, focused, determined to do right by her, and that mattered more than any technical skill. Eliza let herself relax into his arms, let the music carry them, and for a few blessed minutes she forgot about the watching eyes and the whispered comments and the weight of other people's opinions. You're good at this, Caleb murmured against her ear. My father taught me. Said every woman should know how to dance, even if she never got the chance. Did he dance with your mother? All the time, right here in the cabin with no music except what they hummed themselves. She smiled at the memory. He said dancing was important because it taught you how to move with another person, how to trust them to catch you if you stumbled. He said if you could dance with someone, you could build a life with them. Smart man. He was. I wish you could have met him. Me too. The music ended and they stepped apart, breathless and smiling. Around them, other couples reformed, conversations resumed, and slowly the attention shifted away from them. They'd done it, walked into the lion's den, and survived. Now they were just another couple at a dance, unremarkable and therefore safe. Except they weren't safe at all, because Henry Tucker was there. He appeared as Eliza was getting punch, a tall man in his 30s with a weathered face and calculating eyes. She knew him by reputation, a rancher with property bordering hers to the east, ambitious and ruthless in equal measure. He'd made her an offer on her land twice since her father's death, each time increasing the price, as though he could simply outbid her attachment to the place. Miss Hartwell, he said, tipping his hat. You're looking well. Mr. Tucker? I was surprised to see you here. You usually avoid these gatherings. I changed my mind. His gaze slid past her to where Caleb stood talking with one of the other ranchers. I see you brought company. That the hired hand everyone's been talking about? Mr. Rowan isn't hired. He's my partner. Tucker's eyebrows rose. Your partner? That's an interesting way to put it. It's the truth. Hmm. He sipped his punch, watching Caleb with an expression Eliza couldn't read. How long has he been with you? 2 months. And before that? Where'd he come from? I don't see how that's your concern. It's my concern when a stranger shows up on my neighbor's property and nobody knows a damn thing about him. Could be anyone. Could be a thief, a deserter, a man running from the law. Eliza felt her temper flare. He's none of those things. You sure about that? Because I've seen men like him before, drifters who move in on lonely women, make themselves useful, and then one day they're gone, and so is everything of value. You'd be smart to ask some questions before you get too attached. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Tucker, but it's misplaced. Now, if you'll excuse me. He caught her arm as she turned to go, not roughly but firmly enough to stop her. I'm trying to help you, Eliza. Your father was a good man and he'd want someone looking out for his daughter. Don't let some smooth-talking cowboy take advantage of your isolation. She jerked her arm free, furious now. The only person trying to take advantage of my isolation is you. Every time you show up with another offer to buy my land. At least Caleb has the decency to be honest about what he wants. Tucker's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Then it's my mistake to make. She walked away before he could respond, her heart pounding with anger and something close to fear. Because Tucker was right about one thing, she didn't know Caleb's whole story. Didn't know where he'd been or what he'd done in the 4 years before he arrived at her gate. She'd trusted her instincts, trusted the evidence of her own eyes. But what if she was wrong? What if Caleb was exactly what Tucker suggested? A con artist who'd seen an easy mark and decided to exploit it. She found Caleb outside, leaning against the barn wall and looking up at the stars. He turned when he heard her approach, his expression shifting from peaceful to concerned in an instant. What's wrong? Henry Tucker just warned me about you. Said you're probably a thief or worse, that I should ask questions before I get too attached. Caleb went very still. What did you say? I told him to mind his own business. But she stopped, hating herself for the doubt creeping in. Caleb, I don't actually know anything about you. Not really. You've told me bits and pieces, but there's so much I don't know. Where you were, what you did, whether you're running from something. He looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable in the shadows. You want the whole truth? Yes. All right. He took a breath, let it out slow. After I lost the farm in Missouri, I drifted for a while. Did odd jobs, cowboy work mostly. Spent a winter in Denver washing dishes in a hotel kitchen. Then I heard about silver strikes in Colorado and figured I'd try my luck. Worked in the mines for 8 months, saved every penny I could. But I wasn't cut out for it. Couldn't stand being underground, kept having fits where I couldn't breathe and I'd have to stumble out into daylight before I lost my mind completely. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Left the mines and headed north. Worked as a ranch hand in Wyoming, broke horses for a man who paid decent and didn't ask questions. That's where I learned most of what I know about building and fixing. The foreman was good at that kind of thing, and he took the time to teach me. Stayed there almost 2 years, and it was good work, honest work. But then the foreman died in a riding accident, and his nephew took over. And the nephew had ideas about how things should be run that didn't sit well with me. What kind of ideas? The kind that involved stealing cattle from the neighboring ranch and doctoring the brands. The kind that got people hung if they were caught. I told him I wanted no part of it, and he said I was either with them or against them, and if I was against them, I'd better start running because accidents happened to people who knew too much. Eliza felt cold. So you ran. I left. Wouldn't call it running exactly, but I didn't stick around to see how serious he was about those accidents. Caleb met her eyes. I'm not wanted for anything, Eliza. I've never stolen, never killed anyone outside of the war, never done anything that would bring the law down on me. But I have walked away from situations that might have turned ugly if I'd stayed. And I've got no references, no papers, nothing to prove I'm who I say I am except my word. And you expect me to just take your word for it? No, I expect you to decide whether you trust me or not based on what you've seen with your own eyes these past 2 months. I've worked hard. I've been honest with you. I've never taken anything that wasn't offered. That should count for something. It does. But Tucker's right about one thing. I don't really know you, and what if... Her voice cracked. What if I'm wrong about you? What if this is all some elaborate con and one day you're going to disappear with everything I have? Caleb looked at her, and in his eyes she saw hurt but also understanding. If that's what you think I am, then maybe I should leave, because I can't build something with someone who's always waiting for me to betray them. I don't think that. I'm just scared. Of what? Of being a fool. Of loving you so much that I can't see clearly anymore. Of waking up one morning and finding out none of this was real. He closed the distance between them and took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. It's real, Eliza. I swear to you, on everything I have left to lose, this is real. I'm not perfect, and I've made mistakes, and there are probably things in my past I'm not proud of. But I'm not lying to you about how I feel or what I want. I want to stay. I want to build a life here with you. I want to be the man you deserve, even if I'm not sure I know how yet. How do I know you mean it? You don't. That's what faith is, believing in something you can't prove. And I know I'm asking a lot, asking you to have faith in a drifter who showed up at your gate with nothing but a tired horse and too many ghosts. But I'm asking anyway. Because you're worth it. This is worth it. Eliza searched his face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint that he was telling her what she wanted to hear instead of the truth. But all she saw was the same man who'd been there every day for 2 months. Steady, solid, real. The man who'd fixed her fences and hauled water and held her through the night when storms made him shake. The man who loved her. I do trust you, she whispered. I'm afraid of losing this. So am I. But we can be afraid together. She nodded, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight while the music from the barn drifted out into the night. They stood like that for a long time, 2 people clinging to each other against a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. When they finally went back inside, hand in hand, Tucker was watching them with an expression that made Eliza uneasy. But she lifted her chin and met his gaze steadily, and after a moment he looked away. They danced twice more before the evening ended, and when they drove home in Eliza's wagon with the stars bright overhead, Caleb said, "Thank you." For what? For trusting me. For giving me a chance even when you had every reason not to. I didn't have every reason. I had plenty of reasons to take the chance. Name one. You sing while you work, she said simply. Men with bad intentions don't do that. He laughed, surprised and delighted. That's your criteria? Whether I can carry a tune? It's as good as any other. Besides, you also make sure the animals are fed before you feed yourself, and you've never once complained about the work. And you look at me like I hung the moon, even though we both know I'm just a stubborn woman with dirt under her fingernails. You did hang the moon, Caleb said seriously. At least you did for me. Before I met you, everything was dark. Now there's light. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. It's the truth. They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, and when they climbed into bed that night, Caleb held her close and whispered, I'm going to prove to you that I'm worth believing in. I don't know how yet, but I will. You already have, Eliza murmured against his chest, just by staying. But even as she said it, she wondered if staying would be enough, wondered what it would take for both of them to finally stop being afraid. The answer came 2 weeks later, in a way neither of them expected. It started with rain, not the violent storms of early summer, but a steady, soaking rain that settled in and refused to leave. 3 days of it, then 4, then 5, until the creek began to rise and the ground turned to mud, and Eliza started to worry about flooding. The cabin sat on high enough ground that they were safe, but the garden was lower, closer to the creek, and if the water kept rising, they'd lose everything they'd worked so hard to grow. On the 6th day, Caleb woke before dawn and went out to check the water level. When he came back, his face was grim. It's bad, he said. Another few hours and it'll be over the banks. We need to build a levee, try to redirect the flow before it takes out the garden. They worked in the pouring rain, hauling rocks and sandbags and anything else they could find to build a makeshift wall between the rising creek and the vulnerable plants. It was brutal work, backbreaking and cold. And within an hour, Eliza was soaked to the skin and shivering. But she kept going, matching Caleb's pace, refusing to quit even when her muscles screamed and her hands were so numb she could barely grip the rocks. By midday, they'd built a wall 3 feet high and 20 feet long, and the water was lapping at its base. They stood watching it, breathing hard, and Eliza prayed it would hold. It didn't. The wall lasted 2 hours before the pressure became too much, and it collapsed, sending water and rocks and mud cascading into the garden. Eliza watched their careful rows of vegetables disappear under brown water and felt something break inside her. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no!" Caleb grabbed her arm. "The smokehouse. If the water reaches the smokehouse, we'll lose all the meat." They ran, slipping and sliding in the mud, and managed to get the door open and start hauling out the precious stores of salted pork and smoked venison. But the water was rising faster than they could work, and Eliza knew with sick certainty that they weren't going to save it all. "Just take what you can carry," Caleb shouted over the roar of the creek. "Get it to the cabin and I'll get the rest." "I'm not leaving you, Sight." "Eliza, go!" She went, arms full of meat wrapped in oilcloth, running for the cabin while behind her Caleb made trip after trip, racing against the flood. By the time he staggered in with the last load, the water was knee-deep around the smokehouse and still rising. They stood in the cabin doorway, dripping and exhausted, and watched the creek claim what it wanted. The garden was completely underwater. The smokehouse tilted dangerously to one side, its foundation undermined. Even the chicken coop was half submerged, though the birds had had enough sense to roost on the highest perches and were riding it out with offended squawks. "How much did we lose?" Eliza asked, her voice hollow. Caleb did the math in his head. "Maybe half the winter stores. The garden's gone completely. Nothing will survive this. We saved most of the meat, and the grain's safe in the barn. We'll make it through, but it'll be tight." "Tight? That's one way to put it." She laughed, but it came out brittle. "We worked so hard, all summer breaking our backs to make sure we'd have enough. And the creek just took it, like it was nothing." "I know. What are we going to do?" Caleb put his arm around her shoulders. "Same thing we always do. We survive. We adapt. We figure it out. And if we can't, then we go into town and I find work. Construction, carpentry, whatever pays. We'll get through this, Eliza. I promise." She wanted to believe him, wanted to find comfort in his certainty. But standing there watching the water swallow months of labor, she felt the old fear creeping back, the fear that she was going to lose everything, that no matter how hard she fought, the land would defeat her in the end. "Hey," Caleb turned her to face him. "Look at me. We're going to be all right. You hear me? We're going to be all right." "How can you be so sure?" "Because we're together. And together we're stronger than anything this land can throw at us." Eliza wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways that being together didn't guarantee survival, that love couldn't fill empty bellies or replace lost crops. But looking into his eyes, seeing the absolute conviction there, she found herself believing him despite her fear. "All right," she said quietly. "We survive." "Damn right we do." The rain finally stopped that evening, and by morning the water had begun to recede, leaving behind a layer of silt and debris that would take weeks to clear. They spent the next days salvaging what they could, cleaning up the devastation, trying to calculate how bad the losses really were. It was during this work, hip deep in mud and frustration, that Eliza realized something fundamental had shifted. She and Caleb weren't just two people sharing space anymore, weren't just partners in the casual sense. They were a unit, bound together by shared struggle and shared determination. When she stumbled, he was there to catch her. When his old wounds threatened to overwhelm him, she pulled him back to the present. They moved together, thought together, survived together. And that night, as they lay exhausted in bed, Eliza said the words that had been building in her chest for weeks. "Marry me." Caleb went still. "What?" "Marry me. I know it's backward. I know I'm supposed to wait for you to ask, but I don't care about proper anymore. I want this to be official. I want to know that when the next disaster comes, and it will come, we'll face it as husband and wife, not just as two people who happen to share a bed." He pushed up on one elbow, looking down at her in the darkness. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything. Eliza, I don't have a ring, I don't have money for a proper wedding. I can't give you anything except yourself. That's all I want. That's all I've ever wanted." She reached up and touched his face. "Say yes, Caleb, please." He was quiet for so long she thought he might refuse. Then he smiled, and it was like sunrise. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you. 1,000 times yes." And when he kissed her, Eliza tasted salt and knew they were both crying, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd just promised each other. They'd chosen to stay, chosen to build, chosen each other, completely and irrevocably. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They were married 3 days later in Reverend Walsh's small church, with Mrs. Pemberton as witness, because there was no one else available, and because, for all her sharp tongue and rigid opinions, she could still be counted on to do her Christian duty when called upon. Eliza wore her mother's blue calico dress, freshly washed and pressed, with wildflowers in her hair that Caleb had picked that morning from the meadow beyond the ruined garden. Caleb wore his one good shirt, the gray one without holes in the elbows, and he'd shaved so carefully that he'd nicked himself twice and had small cuts on his jaw that Eliza had dabbed with her handkerchief before they left the cabin. The ceremony was brief and simple. Reverend Walsh spoke about commitment and partnership, about two people becoming one flesh, about the sacred responsibility of marriage. He didn't mention love, Eliza noticed, or passion, or any of the romantic notions people usually associated with weddings. Instead, he talked about endurance, about choosing each other in the hard times, about building something that would outlast the moment. When it came time for the vows, Caleb's voice was steady and sure. "I, Caleb Rowan, take you, Eliza Hartwell, to be my wife. I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad, in plenty and in want, in sickness and in health. I promise to work hard, to be honest, to never give you reason to regret this choice. I promise to love you all the days of my life, however many I'm given." Eliza's voice trembled when she spoke, but she meant every word. "I, Eliza Hartwell, take you, Caleb Rowan, to be my husband. I promise to trust you, to believe in you, to build a life with you that honors both our pasts and creates a future worth living. I promise to be strong when you're weak, to remind you of your worth when you forget it, to love you fiercely and without reservation for as long as we both shall live." Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, and when Caleb kissed her it was gentle and reverent, as though he couldn't quite believe this was real, that she was his and he was hers, and no one could take that away from them now. Mrs. Pemberton sniffed loudly and produced a handkerchief, dabbing at her eyes in a way that suggested she was more affected than she wanted to admit. "Well," she said when they broke apart, "that's done then. You're married. I hope you know what you're taking on, the both of you." "We do," Eliza said firmly. We'll see." But her tone was less sharp than usual, and when she shook Caleb's hand, she held it a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Take care of her, Mr. Rowan. She's got more courage than sense sometimes, but she's a good woman. Better than most." "I know," Caleb said quietly. "I'll do my best to deserve her." "See that you do." They walked out of the church into bright September sunlight, and Eliza felt lighter than she had in months. They were married, legally bound, recognized by the church and the territory and anyone else who might have opinions about their arrangement. No more speculation, no more whispers about impropriety. They were husband and wife, and that simple fact changed everything. On the ride back to the homestead, Caleb reached over and took her hand. "How does it feel, being Mrs. Rowan?" Eliza tested the name in her mind. Mrs. Caleb Rowan. Eliza Rowan. She'd been Eliza Hartwell for 26 years, and part of her felt a pang at letting go of that identity, of the connection to her father it represented. But another part of her thrilled at this new name, this new beginning. "It feels right," she said. "Strange, but right. How does it feel being a husband?" "Terrifying, wonderful. Like I just made a promise I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to keep." "You don't have to be perfect, Caleb. You just have to try." "I know, but you deserve perfect." "No," she said, squeezing his hand. "I deserve real, and that's what you are. real and honest and here, and that's more than enough. They spent their wedding night the same way they'd spent every other night for the past month, in the narrow bed in the cabin, wrapped around each other, talking in whispers until sleep claimed them. But somehow it felt different now, weighted with new meaning. This wasn't just two people seeking comfort in each other's arms. This was a husband and wife beginning their life together, and that distinction mattered in ways Eliza couldn't quite articulate, but felt deep in her bones. The work didn't stop for weddings or vows or the changed status of their relationship. Come morning, they were back in the ruins of the garden, clearing debris and assessing what could be salvaged. The flood had destroyed everything except the most hardy plants, and even those looked beaten down, their leaves brown and wilted. It would take years to rebuild the soil quality, to coax the land back into productivity. "We should focus on the new plot," Caleb said, gesturing to a piece of higher ground they'd been eyeing since midsummer. "Clear it this fall, let it rest over winter, plant in the spring. It'll mean starting from scratch, but at least we won't be fighting flood damage." "That's a lot of work." "We've done a lot of work before." Eliza looked at the task ahead of them, clearing brush, pulling stumps, breaking new ground, and felt exhaustion settle into her bones just thinking about it. But Caleb was right. They'd survived worse. They'd survived this too. They worked through September and into October, clearing the new plot in sections, working methodically from one end to the other. The weather cooperated, giving them clear days and cool nights perfect for hard labor. Slowly, painfully, they transformed wild land into cultivated ground, and Eliza felt a fierce pride in what they were accomplishing together. It was during this work that she first noticed the changes in her body. Nothing obvious at first, just a persistent queasiness in the mornings, a bone-deep fatigue that wouldn't lift no matter how much she slept. She ignored it for a week, then two, telling herself it was just the hard work, the stress of the flood, and its aftermath. But when she missed her monthly courses for the second time, she could no longer deny what her body was trying to tell her. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She sat down hard on a stump at the edge of the new garden plot, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach, trying to process this new reality. A baby. She was going to have a baby. She and Caleb were going to be parents. Terror and joy warred inside her chest. A baby meant responsibility, vulnerability, one more mouth to feed in a year when they'd already lost so much. But it also meant family, continuity, proof that something good could grow even in the hardest seasons. It meant her father's bloodline wouldn't end with her, that the homestead would have an heir who would carry it into the future. She didn't tell Caleb right away. Wasn't sure how to form the words, how to explain this enormous thing that was happening inside her body without his knowledge or consent. They'd never discussed children, never talked about whether they wanted them, or when, or how many. The subject had seemed too distant, too abstract, something to worry about later when they'd figured out how to simply survive together. But now later was here, arriving 9 months faster than she'd anticipated, and she had no idea how he would react. She finally told him 3 days later, on a Sunday evening after they'd finished their work and were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. She'd been trying to find the right moment all day, the right words, but everything she practiced in her head sounded wrong, too casual or too dramatic or too uncertain. In the end, she just said it plain. "I'm pregnant." Caleb went very still, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully, precisely, as though the smallest wrong movement might shatter something. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. I've missed twice now, and I'm sick every morning, and—" She gestured helplessly. "My mother used to talk about how it felt being pregnant with me. This feels the same." He didn't speak for a long moment, and in that silence, Eliza felt panic begin to rise. What if he didn't want this? What if the idea of being a father terrified him so much he'd run, finally give in to that old urge to keep moving, to never put down roots deep enough to trap him? Then he turned to her and his face was wet with tears. "A baby," he whispered. "We're going to have a baby." You're not upset?" "Upset?" He laughed, a sound caught between joy and disbelief. "Eliza, I never let myself imagine—" He stopped, swallowed hard. After the war, after everything fell apart, I figured I'd forfeited the right to things like this. Family, children, a future that mattered. And now you're telling me we're going to have a baby, and I don't know if I'm more terrified or grateful, but I'm definitely not upset. Relief flooded through her so intensely she felt dizzy. I'm terrified too. I don't know the first thing about being a mother, and I don't know anything about being a father. But we'll learn together, same way we've learned everything else. He pulled her into his arms, held her tight. When? April, I think, maybe early May. That gives us time. Time to finish the new garden plot. Time to get more supplies laid in. Time to... He pulled back, his expression shifting to concern. Should you be working so hard? Is it safe for the baby? I'm pregnant, not fragile. Women have been working through pregnancies since the beginning of time. I know, but... Caleb... She took his face in her hands. I'm strong. I'm healthy. I'll tell you if something feels wrong, but I'm not going to spend the next 7 months sitting in a chair like an invalid. We have too much to do. He nodded, though she could see the worry in his eyes. All right, but you have to promise me you'll rest when you need to. No pushing yourself past your limits. I promise. They sat together as darkness fell, Caleb's hand resting on her stomach, as though he could feel the tiny life growing there. And maybe he could, Eliza thought. Maybe that was what marriage meant, being so connected to another person that their joys and fears and small miracles became your own. The pregnancy changed things in subtle ways. Caleb became even more protective, constantly asking if she needed to rest, if she was feeling well, if there was anything he could do. It was endearing at first, then mildly annoying, and finally just part of their new normal. Eliza learned to accept his concern without taking offense, to recognize it for what it was. Not doubt in her strength, but fear of losing something precious. As fall deepened into winter, they worked to prepare the cabin for a baby. Caleb built a cradle from scraps of wood left over from earlier projects, sanding it smooth and carving simple designs into the headboard, flowers and stars, and a small horse that made Eliza's heart ache with tenderness. She sewed tiny clothes from fabric she'd been saving, her stitches careful, and even despite hands that sometimes trembled with the weight of what she was making. These small garments, these preparations, made the abstract reality of the baby more concrete. They didn't go to town much that winter. The weather was too unpredictable, and Eliza's condition made the long wagon ride uncomfortable. But word spread anyway, the way it always did in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. When they did venture in for supplies in late November, they were met with a mixture of reactions, genuine congratulations from some, thinly veiled judgment from others who'd done the math and realized the baby had been conceived before the wedding. Let them talk, Caleb said when Eliza mentioned the whispers she'd heard. We know the truth. That's all that matters. Does it bother you? What they think? Not even a little. I'm too damn happy to care what a bunch of gossips have to say about the timing of our child's conception. His certainty steadied her, reminded her that they'd built something real and solid that didn't need anyone else's approval to exist. Still, when Mrs. Pemberton pulled her aside at the general store and offered unsolicited advice about childbirth and infant care, Eliza found herself listening with more attention than she'd expected. You'll want to have someone with you when the time comes, Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. Your mother died in childbirth, and while I'm sure you'll be fine, it's better to be cautious. I've helped deliver more babies than I can count. If you want, I can come stay with you as you get close to your time. Eliza was so surprised by the offer, she didn't know what to say. Thank you. That's very kind. Kindness has nothing to do with it. It's practical sense. You're living too far from town to get help quickly if something goes wrong. Better to have someone there who knows what they're doing. I'll think about it. You do that, and in the meantime, eat plenty of red meat and greens. Keep your strength up. Don't let that husband of yours work you too hard. I won't. Mrs. Pemberton studied her for a moment, and something in her expression softened. You know, when I first heard about you and Mr. Rowan, I thought you were making a terrible mistake. Rushing into things with a man you barely knew, risking your reputation and your future on someone who might not stay. But I've watched the two of you these past months, And I have to admit, you chose better than I gave you credit for. He's a good man. He'll take care of you. I know. See that he does. And if he ever gives you trouble, you come to me. I'll set him straight. Eliza smiled despite herself. I appreciate that. Walking back to the wagon where Caleb was loading their supplies, Eliza felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. She'd spent so long being judged by these people, so long fighting their expectations and their pity, that she'd forgotten some of them were capable of changing their minds. Mrs. Pemberton's grudging approval mattered more than she wanted to admit. What was that about? Caleb asked when she climbed up beside him. Mrs. Pemberton offered to help with the delivery. Said she doesn't want me going through it alone. That's surprisingly decent of her. I thought so too. They rode home through the early winter landscape, the mountains sharp and white against a pale blue sky. Snow was coming, Eliza could smell it in the air, and soon the homestead would be locked in until spring thaw. But they were ready. They had food stored, firewood stacked, the cabin chinked tight against the cold. And they had each other, which seemed like the most important preparation of all. December came hard and fast, bringing storms that buried the homestead under 3 feet of snow. They spent long days inside, doing small tasks by firelight, mending harnesses, sharpening tools, reading aloud from her father's books. Caleb carved more things for the baby, and Eliza knitted tiny caps and bootees, her needles clicking in the quiet while wind howled outside. It was during these long winter evenings that they really talked, sharing stories they'd never gotten around to before. Caleb told her about his childhood in Missouri, about a mother who'd died young and a father who'd worked himself to death trying to keep the farm running. About enlisting at 17 because it seemed like an adventure and coming home at 21 hollowed out by things no one should have to see. Eliza told him about her mother, about the few scattered memories she had of a woman with gentle hands and a voice like music. About growing up as her father's shadow, learning to hunt and fish and do the work of sons he'd never had. About the loneliness that had shaped her, the isolation that had taught her to be strong, but also left her uncertain about how to let someone close. Do you ever wish things had been different? Caleb asked one night. That your father had stayed in Ohio, that you'd grown up around people instead of wilderness. Eliza considered this. Sometimes. When I was younger, I used to imagine what it would be like to have friends my own age, to go to parties and dances, to have choices about who I might marry, instead of just hoping someone would overlook the fact that I was more comfortable with a rifle than a sewing needle. But now, she looked around the cabin, at the life they'd built. Now I think everything happened exactly the way it needed to. If my father hadn't come west, if I'd grown up in Ohio, I never would have met you. Never would have learned what it means to love someone without conditions. So no, I don't wish for different. I'm grateful for what is. Even though it's been hard, especially because it's been hard, easy things don't teach you anything. They don't show you what you're made of. Caleb reached for her hand. What are you made of, Eliza Rowan? Same thing as you. Stubbornness and hope and the desperate need to prove we deserve the happiness we've found. He laughed. That's about right. By January, Eliza's body had changed enough that there was no hiding her condition. Her belly swelled round beneath her dresses, and she felt the baby move for the first time on a quiet afternoon while she was kneading bread dough. A flutter, barely perceptible, like butterfly wings against the inside of her skin. She froze, hands covered in flour, hardly daring to breathe as she waited to feel it again. There. Another flutter, stronger this time. Caleb, she called, and he came running from the barn where he'd been mucking stalls, alarmed by the urgency in her voice. What's wrong? Is it the baby? Are you... She grabbed his hand and pressed it to her stomach. Wait, just wait. They stood like that for a long minute, barely breathing, and then it happened again, that small, insistent movement. Caleb's eyes went wide, his expression transforming from worry to wonder. That's our baby. Saying hello. He dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the cabin floor and pressed his face against her stomach, his arms wrapped around her waist. Hello, he whispered. Hello, little one. I'm your father, and I promise you, I promise, I'm going to do everything I can to be worthy of you. Eliza ran her fingers through his hair, tears streaming down her face, And in that moment, she felt more certain than she'd ever felt about anything. This was right. This was meant to be. Whatever struggles lay ahead, whatever challenges they'd face, they would face them together. The three of them, bound by blood and choice, and the fierce determination to build something that would last. February brought the worst storm of the winter, 3 days of howling wind and snow that came down so thick they couldn't see the barn from the cabin window. They stayed inside, rationing firewood and food, telling stories and playing cards, and trying not to think about what would happen if the storm didn't break before their supplies ran out. On the third night, when the wind had finally died down and they could hear again without shouting, Caleb said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About what happens after the baby comes. About how we're going to manage. 2 of us working the land, caring for a child, trying to rebuild what the flood took. It's a lot. We'll manage. We always do." "I know, but I think we should consider hiring help. Someone to work the heavy jobs so you're not killing yourself while trying to care for an infant." Eliza bristled instinctively. "We don't have money for that." "Not yet, but if I take on some work in town this spring, construction jobs, maybe some blacksmithing, we could save enough to bring someone on for the summer, just through harvest. It would make things easier." "I don't need easy." "I know you don't, but maybe you deserve it anyway. Maybe we both do." He took her hand. "I'm not saying you can't handle it. I know you can. You're the strongest person I've ever met. I'm just saying you shouldn't have to handle it alone. That's why you married me, remember? So you'd have someone to share the burden." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist they could do it themselves the way they'd done everything else. But looking at Caleb's earnest face, seeing the genuine concern there, she realized he was right. Pride had its place, but it shouldn't come at the expense of their health or the baby's well-being. "All right," she said finally. "If you can find work in town, we'll hire someone for the summer, but just for the summer." "Just for the summer," he agreed. They made it through the rest of the winter on determination and the dwindling contents of their storeroom. By March, the snow had begun to melt, and the first green shoots were pushing through the mud, and Eliza's belly had grown so large she could barely see her own feet. Mrs. Pemberton came to visit, true to her word, and examined Eliza with the efficient practicality of someone who'd seen it all before. "Baby's sitting right," she announced. "Should be a straightforward delivery, barring complications. When did you say you were due?" "Late April, I think." Could be sooner. First babies like to surprise you." She fixed Eliza with a stern look. "I meant what I said about being here. When you get close, send word and I'll come. Better to have me here a week early than an hour too late." "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton." "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've survived childbirth. Then we'll see if you still want to express gratitude." But despite her gruff manner, Eliza could see the genuine care beneath it. Mrs. Pemberton might have started out disapproving of their marriage, but she'd softened considerably over the winter, and Eliza was grateful for the support, even if it came wrapped in sharp words and practical advice. April arrived with all the chaos of spring, rain and mud and animals waking from winter lethargy. The new garden plot was ready for planting, and Caleb threw himself into the work with renewed energy, determined to make up for what they'd lost to the flood. Eliza helped as much as she could, but her body was unwieldy now. Her center of gravity shifted, her back aching constantly from the weight she carried. On April 15th, 3 weeks before she was due, the pains started. She was hanging laundry when the first contraction hit, a tightening across her belly that stole her breath and made her grip the clothesline for support. It passed after a moment, leaving her shaky but functional, and she told herself it was nothing. False labor, the kind Mrs. Pemberton had warned her about. The baby wasn't due for 3 more weeks. But an hour later it happened again, stronger this time, and then again 20 minutes after that. By mid-afternoon, Eliza could no longer deny what her body was telling her. The baby was coming early and insistent, and there was nothing she could do but surrender to the inevitable. Caleb found her sitting on the porch steps, breathing through another contraction, her face pale and beaded with sweat. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. The baby's just decided it's time." His face went white. "Now? But you're not due for—" "Babies don't care about schedules, Caleb. You need to ride to town and get Mrs. Pemberton, as fast as you can. I'm not leaving you alone. You have to. I need her here, and she's at least 2 hours away even if you push the horse hard. Go. Now." He stood frozen for a moment, torn between the need to get help and the fear of leaving her. Then another contraction gripped her, and she couldn't hide the pain, couldn't keep the small sound of distress from escaping her throat, and that decided him. "I'll be as fast as I can," he said, already moving toward the barn. Just don't do anything until I get back with her." Eliza would have laughed if she'd had the breath for it. Don't do anything. As though she had any control over what her body was doing, as though she could simply tell the baby to wait politely until the adults were better prepared. She heard him ride out at a gallop, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance, and then she was alone with the pain and the fear and the knowledge that this was happening whether she was ready or not. The contractions came faster as the afternoon wore on, each one building on the last until there was barely time to catch her breath between them. She tried to remember everything Mrs. Pemberton had told her about childbirth, all the practical advice about breathing and pushing and what to expect, but it all seemed abstract now, useless in the face of this primal force taking over her body. She made her way inside and prepared as best she could, spread old blankets on the bed, set water to boil, laid out clean cloths and the scissors she'd sterilized that morning in a fit of nesting anxiety. Then she lay down and tried to breathe, tried to stay calm, tried not to think about her mother who died doing exactly this. Time became strange, elastic. Minutes stretched into hours or collapsed into seconds, she couldn't tell which. The pain was unlike anything she'd experienced, not sharp, but deep, rolling, overwhelming. It didn't come and go so much as ebb and flow like a tide, and she was drowning in it, gasping for air in the brief moments when it receded. She heard horses outside and thought it must be Caleb returning with Mrs. Pemberton, but when the cabin door opened it was only Caleb, his face wild with worry. "She wasn't home," he said, breathless from the hard ride. "Her daughter said she went to help with a difficult birth at the Morrison place, won't be back until tomorrow at the earliest. Eliza, what do we do?" Another contraction hit before she could answer, and she curled around the pain, biting down on her lip to keep from screaming. When it passed, she looked at her husband and saw her own terror reflected in his eyes. "You're going to have to help me," she said, her voice shaking. "There's no one else." "I don't know how. I don't know anything about this." "Neither do I. But women have been having babies since the beginning of time. We'll figure it out. What if something goes wrong? What if I do something wrong and you or the baby?" "Caleb." She reached for his hand, gripped it hard. "I need you to be strong right now. I need you to put aside your fear and help me. Can you do that?" He swallowed hard and she watched him gather himself, watched him push down the panic and find that core of steady determination that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I can do that. Tell me what you need." "Water, clean cloths, and your hands. I'm going to need your hands." He moved with purpose then, fetching everything she asked for, building up the fire so the cabin was warm, rolling up his sleeves. When the next contraction came, he sat beside her on the bed and let her squeeze his hand hard enough to bruise, and he didn't flinch, didn't pull away. The afternoon bled into evening and evening into night. The contractions grew stronger, closer together, until Eliza couldn't tell where one ended and another began. Her world narrowed to pain and breath and Caleb's voice in her ear, low and steady, telling her she could do this. She was strong. She was almost there. "I can't," she gasped at some point when the pain had become unbearable, and she couldn't remember why she'd ever thought having a baby was a good idea. "I can't do this anymore." "Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I know. You can do anything." "My mother died doing this." "You're not your mother. You're you, and you're going to survive this, and our baby is going to be fine, and years from now we'll tell this story and laugh about how terrified we both were." "I'm not laughing. Not yet. But you will." Sometime deep in the night, something changed. The pain shifted, became purposeful instead of simply overwhelming. Her body knew what to do, even if her mind didn't, and she felt the urge to push building like a wave she couldn't fight. I think it's time," she said. Caleb moved to the end of the bed, his face pale but determined. "I can see the head. Eliza, I can see our baby's head. You're doing it. Just keep going. She bore down with the next contraction, pushing with everything she had, and felt something shift and give. The pain was immense, but there was progress now, movement, the sense that this ordeal had an endpoint, even if she couldn't see it yet. Again, Caleb said. When the next one comes, push again. She did, and again, and again. Each push bringing the baby closer, each moment of rest shorter than the last, until finally, with a rush of pressure and pain and relief so intense she sobbed, the baby slipped free into Caleb's waiting hands. For one terrible moment, there was only silence. No cry, no movement, nothing but Caleb staring down at the tiny bundle in his arms with an expression Eliza couldn't read. Is it? She couldn't finish the question, couldn't bear to hear the answer if it was the one she feared. Then the baby took its first breath and wailed, a sound so pure and furious and alive that Eliza started laughing and crying at the same time. Caleb was crying too, tears streaming down his face as he carefully, reverently laid the baby on Eliza's chest. "It's a girl," he said, his voice breaking. "We have a daughter." Eliza looked down at the red, wrinkled, perfect little face and felt her heart crack open in a way she'd never experienced before. This was her daughter, hers and Caleb's, this tiny person who hadn't existed 9 months ago and who now existed more fully, more completely than anything else in the world. "Hello," she whispered, touching one impossibly small hand. "Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you." The baby's fingers curled around hers, gripping with surprising strength, and Eliza felt the last piece of herself that had been holding back, protecting itself against hurt, finally surrender. This was what it meant to love without reservation. This was what her mother had felt, what her father had felt, what every parent throughout history had felt when confronted with the miracle of new life. Caleb helped her through the rest. The delivery of the afterbirth, the cleaning up, the bundling of their daughter in soft cloths while Eliza rested. He moved with surprising competence, following instincts he didn't know he had, and when everything was done and they were all settled, Eliza propped against pillows, the baby nursing tentatively at her breast, Caleb sitting beside them with one arm around his wife and one finger captured by his daughter's tiny fist. The enormity of what they'd just accomplished hit them both. "We did it," Eliza said wonderingly. "We actually did it." "You did it. I just tried not to pass out. You were perfect. You kept me calm when I was falling apart." "You were never falling apart. You were the bravest thing I've ever seen." He pressed his lips to her temple. "I've never been more in awe of anyone in my entire life." They sat in the lamplight, watching their daughter breathe, counting her fingers and toes, marveling at the perfection of her tiny ears and the dark fuzz of hair on her head. She had Caleb's gray eyes, Eliza thought, or at least they looked gray in this light, and her nose was definitely Eliza's, small and slightly upturned. "What should we name her?" Caleb asked. Eliza had been thinking about this for months, running through options in her mind. But now, looking at her daughter's face, only one name felt right. "Sarah, after my mother. Sarah Hope Rowan." "Hope," Caleb repeated softly. "I like that. It's what she is. Our hope for the future." "Yes." They dozed fitfully through what remained of the night, waking every time Sarah made a sound, neither of them quite believing she was real, that they'd actually brought her safely into the world. When dawn light finally crept through the window, Eliza felt exhausted and exhilarated and utterly transformed. She was a mother now. That identity felt huge, unwieldy, terrifying, and wonderful in equal measure. Mrs. Pemberton arrived late the next morning, bursting through the cabin door in a flurry of practical energy. She took one look at Eliza in bed with the baby and let out a sound somewhere between exasperation and relief. "You couldn't wait, could you? Had to go and have that baby without me." "I didn't have much choice in the timing." She came closer, examining both mother and child with expert eyes. "Well, you seem to have managed well enough without me. Baby looks healthy. You look like you've been through a battle, but you're alive." And she turned to Caleb. "You helped with the delivery?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you didn't faint?" "No, ma'am." "Well, that's something, I suppose. Most men would have run screaming. You've got more spine than I gave you credit for." She turned back to Eliza. Let me see her properly. Eliza handed over Sarah reluctantly, watching as Mrs. Pemberton examined the baby with gentle, practiced hands. After a thorough inspection, she nodded in satisfaction. She's perfect. A bit small, but that's to be expected coming early. Keep her warm, make sure she's nursing regularly, and she'll do just fine. She handed Sarah back. You did good, Eliza. Your mother would be proud. The words hit Eliza harder than she expected, and she found herself blinking back tears. Thank you. Don't thank me. You did all the work. I'm just here to make sure you don't do anything foolish in the recovery. She fixed both of them with a stern look. That means rest. Real rest, not just sitting around finding things to do. You've got at least 2 weeks of healing ahead of you, and if you try to rush it, you'll only make things worse. I'll make sure she rests, Caleb said firmly. See that you do. And you, she pointed at him. You'll be doing all the cooking and cleaning and animal care for the next while. Think you can manage that? Yes, ma'am. Good. I'll come back in a week to check on you both. In the meantime, send word if anything seems wrong. Fever, excessive bleeding, anything that doesn't feel right. Understand? We understand, Eliza said. Mrs. Pemberton stayed for another hour, showing Caleb how to change diapers and swaddle the baby, giving Eliza advice about nursing and recovery. Then she packed up her things and prepared to leave, pausing at the door to look back at them. You've got yourselves a beautiful family, she said, and her voice was softer than Eliza had ever heard it. Don't take it for granted. These early days, they're hard and exhausting, and sometimes you'll wonder what you've gotten yourselves into. But they're also precious. They go faster than you think, so even when you're tired and overwhelmed, try to remember how lucky you are. After she left, Caleb and Eliza looked at each other across the cabin. He standing by the stove with flour on his hands from his first attempt at making bread, she sitting in bed with their sleeping daughter in her arms, and they both started laughing at the absurdity of it all. Here they were, two people who'd been strangers less than a year ago, now bound together by vows and a baby, and the sheer improbability of having survived everything that had brought them to this moment. The next weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and steep learning curves. Sarah proved to be a demanding baby, waking every few hours to nurse, fussing when she was wet or cold, or simply wanted to be held. Eliza discovered muscles she didn't know she had were sore from labor, and the simple act of walking to the outhouse left her exhausted. But slowly, day by day, she healed and strengthened, and slowly they all figured out how to be a family. Caleb took to fatherhood with an intensity that surprised them both. He sang to Sarah while he worked, carried her around in a sling Eliza fashioned from a shawl, talked to her constantly in that low, soothing voice that seemed to calm her when nothing else would. Eliza would watch them together, her husband and daughter, and feel her heart swell with love so fierce it frightened her. By May, when the trees were fully leafed and the garden was planted, and Sarah had grown plump and healthy, Caleb made good on his promise to find work in town. He took on carpentry jobs, building additions and repairing roofs, saving every penny toward hiring summer help. True to his word, in June he brought home a young man named Thomas, who just arrived from Kansas looking for farm work. Thomas was quiet and hard-working, and with his help they were able to plant twice as much as they'd managed the previous year. The summer was hot and busy, filled with the constant work of tending crops and animals, and a baby who grew more alert and interactive every day. Sarah started smiling in July, started laughing in August, and by September she could sit up on her own and was trying to crawl. Each milestone felt like a miracle, proof that they were doing something right despite their inexperience. One evening in late September, after Thomas had gone back to town and the harvest was safely stored and Sarah was asleep in her cradle, Eliza and Caleb sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. It had been exactly 1 year since the flood that had nearly destroyed them. 1 year since they'd decided to marry and build a life together despite all the reasons it might not work. "Do you ever regret it?" Eliza asked, the question she'd been carrying for months finally breaking free. "Staying here? Giving up your freedom?" Caleb looked at her surprised. "Not even once. Do you?" "No, but I wonder sometimes if you do. If you wake up and feel that old restlessness, that need to move on." He took her hand, laced their fingers together the way he'd done 100 times before. "I won't lie and say I never feel it. There are still mornings when I wake up, and my first thought is about what lies beyond the horizon, about all the places I haven't seen and probably never will. But then I look at you and Sarah, at this life we've built, and I realize I don't want to see those places. Not if it means leaving this behind. You're sure? Eliza, I told you once that I'd been running for 4 years because I didn't think I deserved to stop. You proved me wrong. You showed me that deserving has nothing to do with it. It's about choosing. Every day I wake up and I choose to stay. I choose you and Sarah and this homestead and this life. That's not restlessness. That's commitment. She squeezed his hand, blinking back tears. I love you. I love you too. More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the stars came out. The same stars that had witnessed their first tentative conversations, their first kiss, their first night as husband and wife. So much had changed in 1 year, and yet the essential truth remained the same. They had chosen each other, and they kept choosing each other, and that made all the difference. The years that followed brought the usual mix of hardship and joy that characterized life on the frontier. There were good harvests and bad, years when they had plenty, and years when they scraped by on stubbornness and careful rationing. Sarah grew into a bright, curious child who followed her father around the homestead, asking endless questions, and helped her mother in the garden with the serious concentration of someone who understood the importance of the work. When Sarah was 3, they had a son they named James after Caleb's father. 2 years after that came another daughter, Emma. The cabin grew crowded and noisy, filled with the sound of children's laughter and arguments and the 1,000 small dramas of family life. Caleb built an addition to give them more space, and they acquired more land, more animals, more of the trappings of permanence. Henry Tucker tried one more time to buy their property, offering an obscene amount of money and looking genuinely baffled when they turned him down. "You could retire on what I'm offering," he said. "Move to a city, give your children real opportunities." "Our children have opportunities here," Eliza replied coolly. "They have land that's theirs, a legacy they can build on. That's worth more than any amount of money you could offer." He'd ridden away shaking his head, and they never heard from him again. Mrs. Pemberton became a fixture in their lives, arriving unannounced to check on the children, bringing small gifts and sharp-tongued advice in equal measure. She never quite admitted that she'd been wrong about Caleb, but her actions spoke louder than words. The way she asked his opinion on matters, the way she bragged about their family to anyone who would listen, the way she looked at them with something very close to affection, even when she was scolding them for some perceived foolishness. The homestead prospered under their combined efforts. What had been bare survival when Eliza lived alone became something approaching comfort with Caleb's partnership. They weren't wealthy, would never be wealthy by any standard that mattered to people like Henry Tucker. But they had enough food, enough warmth, enough love and laughter to fill the spaces that used to echo with loneliness. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb finally bought Eliza a ring, a simple band of gold that he slipped onto her finger while the children slept, and the fire crackled and she cried because she'd never expected such a gesture, had long ago accepted that their marriage would be marked by work and commitment rather than symbols. "I know it's late," he said, his thumb rubbing over the ring. "I should have done this years ago, but I wanted to wait until I could afford something that would last, something you could pass down to Sarah or Emma someday." "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect." "I'm not, but I'm yours, and I'm trying, and apparently that's been enough. More than enough. You're everything I never knew I needed." They made love that night with the slow, familiar ease of two people who knew each other's bodies as well as their own, who'd learned over years how to give and receive pleasure, how to communicate without words. And afterward, lying in the darkness with Caleb's arm around her and his breath warm against her neck, Eliza thought about the woman she'd been 10 years ago, alone, hardened, convinced that independence meant never needing anyone. That woman wouldn't recognize the life she had now, wouldn't believe that the stranger who'd appeared at her gate asking for water would become the center of her entire world, the axis around which everything else turned, wouldn't understand how marriage could be both terrifyingly vulnerable and infinitely stronger than standing alone. But Eliza understood it now, understood that love wasn't about rescue or completion or any of the romantic notions she'd dismissed as foolish. It was about choosing, every single day, to build something together. It was about trust earned through shared hardship and joy celebrated in quiet moments. It was about two imperfect people deciding that their combined imperfections created something worth fighting for. On a spring morning, much like the one when Caleb first arrived, Eliza stood in the garden watching her children play while her husband repaired a fence in the distance. Sarah was 14 now, tall and capable, already showing signs of the strength and stubbornness she'd inherited from both parents. James was 11, quiet and thoughtful like his father, with a gift for fixing broken things. Emma was 9, bright and curious and utterly fearless. Caleb looked up from his work and caught her watching. He smiled, that slow warming of his face that still had the power to make her heart skip, and raised a hand in greeting. She waved back, and in that simple gesture was contained everything they'd built, all the years of work and worry, all the nights of passion and tenderness, all the moments of doubt overcome by determination. He'd asked her once, years ago, if she ever regretted saying yes when he asked to stay. The question had seemed important then, weighted with all his insecurities about deserving happiness. But standing in the garden she'd rebuilt 3 times, watching children who existed because 2 broken people had found each other, the question felt almost absurd. Regret implied she'd made a choice she wished she could unmake. But everything good in her life stemmed from that single moment when she'd looked at a tired stranger and decided to offer him more than water. That one act of kindness or faith or perhaps simple loneliness had cascaded into everything that mattered. Sarah called out something about the chickens getting into the vegetable patch, and Eliza turned to help, laughing at the minor crisis that would be forgotten by evening. This was her life now, not quiet or simple or particularly easy, but full in ways she'd never imagined possible, full of noise and mess and love so pervasive she sometimes forgot it was there, until moments like this, when she stopped and really looked at what they'd created. Caleb finished the fence repair and walked over, pulling off his hat to wipe sweat from his forehead. Without a word, he wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close, and they stood together watching their children chase errant chickens across the yard. "Do you remember the flood?" Eliza asked. "When we lost everything, and I asked you to marry me?" "Of course. I was so scared then. Scared we wouldn't make it through the winter. Scared we'd starve. Scared I'd made a terrible mistake tying you to this place when you'd spent 4 years trying to stay unattached." Caleb was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing small circles on her hip. "I was scared too. Scared I'd fail you. Scared I'd wake up one morning and the old demons would be stronger than my reasons for staying. Scared I'd become my father, a man who loved his family but worked himself to death trying to provide for them." "But you didn't fail. We didn't fail." "No, we didn't." He turned her to face him, his gray eyes serious. "You asked me once if I ever regret staying. I'll answer you now the same way I would have answered you then. Not a single day. Not one moment of hardship or doubt or fear has made me wish I'd kept riding that day instead of stopping at your gate. This life, this family, it's the only thing I've ever done that mattered, the only thing I've built that I'm proud of." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you. I know I don't say it enough, but I do. I love you more now than I did 10 years ago, and I loved you then so much it terrified me. I know, and I love you. Not because you saved me, though you did. Not because you gave me children or a home or a purpose, though you gave me all those things. I love you because you looked at a broken man and saw someone worth believing in. Because you had the courage to take a chance on someone who had nothing to offer but his hands and his word. Because you taught me that deserving happiness was never the point, choosing it was." They kissed there in the garden, while their children shrieked and laughed and the chickens scattered in all directions, and Eliza thought about her mother who'd died bringing her into the world, about her father who'd spent his life building something from nothing, about all the people who'd come before her and struggled and loved and survived so that she could be standing here in this moment. She thought about Mrs. Pemberton's warning years ago that once damaged, a woman's reputation could never be fully restored. How wrong that had been. Eliza's reputation now was as solid as anyone's in the territory. Known as a woman who'd built a successful homestead, who'd raised 3 strong children, who'd chosen her husband wisely and stood by him through everything. If people remembered the scandal of their early days together, they never mentioned it. Success had a way of rewriting history. Most of all, she thought about the woman she'd been before Caleb arrived, isolated, defensive, convinced that strength meant never needing anyone. That woman had been surviving, barely, mistaking endurance for triumph. The woman she'd become understood that real strength wasn't about standing alone. It was about having the courage to let someone stand beside you, about building something together that neither of you could have built alone. As the sun climbed higher and the day's work called them back, Eliza took one last look at her homestead. The cabin Caleb had expanded and improved, the garden they'd rebuilt together, the children who represented their combined hope for the future. This was what they'd built from that single moment of connection, that one choice to say yes when every logical reason screamed no. And standing there with her husband's hand in hers and their children's laughter filling the air, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that she'd choose it all again. Every hardship, every moment of doubt, every fear overcome. Because this noisy, messy, beautiful life was worth everything it had cost to create. They'd started as strangers, become partners, and forged themselves into a family that would outlast them both. Not through some grand romantic gesture or divine intervention, but through the simple daily choice to keep choosing each other, to build instead of break, to stay instead of run, to love instead of fear. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.